Welcome, and thanks for watching this webinar. I'm Sue Shermer from Heartland Area Education Agency, where I support the work of school counselors.
And I'm Meredith Doman with Des Moines Public Schools and serve as the Student Supports Coordinator, so I coordinate the counseling program.
And we're here to talk today about the evaluation supplement for school counselors that was created over this past year. And to give you just a little bit of history, both Meredith and I are on the Iowa School Counseling Association State Board. And one meeting, we had conversations about the connections between the Iowa teaching standards and school counselors, because it seems like many administrators and counselors struggle in that evaluation process for how are they going to be evaluated. And there are many documents floating out there that are crosswalks of artifacts that you can use to demonstrate those standards, but nowhere does it really say, well, this is what the standard looks like for teachers, and this is what it looks like for school counselors. And so at that ISCA board meeting, it was decided that ISCA would support the work of a committee of folks from across the state to do that work. And Meredith and I were fortunate enough to lead that group. And so we started out at the very beginning thinking about, in a perfect world, what would that look like? And we didn't want it to be just another checkoff, but rather something that would be used as a reflection tool for school counselors, and also an advocacy tool and an education tool for school administrators.
And so from there, our work began to work with a committee of counselors from across the state who all volunteered to support this work. And we started working, Sue and I first, and looking at the 8 Iowa teaching standards and then comparing them to a very lengthy document of school counselor competencies. Those school counselor competencies cover about 5 key areas, but then have 204 detailed competencies within those 5 areas, compared to the Iowa teaching standards of the 8 and 43. So looking at that, we first started with breaking down what are those key areas, and we discovered that a lot of the detail in those 204 competencies was about what a counseling program looks like or what counselors do day in and day out. It wasn't necessarily the higher level competency that they need to be able to demonstrate in order to show that they are being an effective counselor and implementing an effective comprehensive counseling program. So from there, we took that and began the work of an alignment. It's not necessarily a direct crosswalk, but aligning those key areas to make sure they were all covered at a high level, and then distributed that out amongst the team to see what had missed, what they found that was different, and separated those out, compiled all of that work back, and had the framework. Then from there, we took what to do with all the rest that wasn't covered, because we didn't want to just ignore some of those other competencies. So we'll walk you through here later this actual supplement, but we then took that doing piece and created a rubric. So there's an alignment of the standards, but then there's also more detail to cover all the rest of those nitty-gritty competencies along the way.
And those competencies, as we said, did come from the school counselor competencies from ASCA, but going on the work of Charlotte Danielson and her framework for teacher evaluation, and how this really gives some insight into how might I move from effective to highly effective, or move from maybe not quite meeting the standard into meeting the standard. That's what we wanted to do. And again, as Meredith said, we'll go through each one of those at a more in-depth level later.
And so after we had all of that feedback from counselors across the state, Sue and I then worked together to compile, and we tried to stay true to all original published documents as best as we could. This came from the American School Counselor Association competencies, language in that ASCA national model, language from our Iowa framework, which is tied to the Department of Education site visits and what is looked for in terms of having a comprehensive counseling program in place. So we did have to make some grammatical changes to make sure the document flowed and had similar language and structure. But beyond that, wanted to keep it true to the original forms and have as minimal interpretation of those of us on the team working as possible. So then from there, we submitted it out to vet it through several administrative channels, looked at school practicing principals and administrators across the state who took some time to dig into this and give us some feedback and look at some of the language used and help ask for some clarifying questions. Went through school administrators of Iowa as well. And very, very grateful for the amount of feedback that we've received along the way with this document.
And so now it's ready, it's in print. We anticipate that there may be revisions coming forward as our world changes, As we know, in education, it often does. But this is our purpose, and we're hopeful that you find it helpful for you, again, not only in looking at your work, but for administrators as they are looking at what should they be expecting from a school counselor. There is one caveat. Please be aware that you can't be required to use this, because that would impact some teacher union decisions or education union decisions, but that this is a document that's highly suggested, and that's why it's an evaluation supplement. It's not required, but it is certainly one for you to use for your professional growth and movement.
And so with that in mind, we think it's a very reflective tool for counselors, and hopefully will help other stakeholders in the school and across the state understand the unique role and skill set of school counselors.
Thank you. So let's dig right into the document. You'll notice at the top of this, it shows that it's dated 2014, and that's because that's when this document came out. We put the date on because we're anticipating that we'll make some refinements, some updates, and we'll be able to keep track of which year we do those things. The inside front page talks about just general introduction to the document, as well as a quote from Dr. Brad Buck, who's been very supportive in this process. You'll notice page 3 holds a summary levels of performance. This sheet is a way for a one-shot quick look at where you are in all 8 standards. It's got what your current state is, as well as your desired state, and any notes you want to make. The nice part about this is that you can use this document as a planning tool when you're preparing your annual professional development plan. The other thing is that keep in mind, as you are looking at this, you don't need to improve in each one of the 8 standards every year. Choose something to really focus on and then make that growth significant.
And then as we move forward in the document, you'll see the Standard 1 from the Iowa Teaching Standards summarized as student achievement. And the first sentence up there explains that from the Iowa Teaching Standard language, the paragraph in red is how that has been interpreted and connected to the American School Counselor Association aligned competencies. So down below on the left, you'll see the criteria for Standard 1 labeled A, B, C, D, etc. And then in the box to the right, the aligned school counselor competencies. Now those competencies are more high level of what is directly connected to that standard. And then on the next page, you'll see the criteria. That's where most of the doing comes in. The details are laid out based on the American School Counselor Association competencies. You'll see at the top the labels from highly effective, effective, developing or needs improvement, and ineffective. Just want to point out, we'll dig into each of these standards in a separate webinar, but that basically the effective is what every counselor should have the opportunity to do. We understand that there may be barriers to being highly effective, so that is why we have 2 separate levels there of both meeting the standard. And then it also does not exclude the things from developing or needs improvement. You'll see along the lines some of these things all flow together, and so developing or needs improvement also could be part of effective, and then highly effective would include all of that content. We also have ineffective on there as it does not meet the standard, simply because we need to acknowledge that there are things that can happen out there in our schools that are ineffective and potentially detrimental to our students and that we serve through a comprehensive counseling program.
As you go through the document, you'll see that there is an empty page, and that page is intentionally left blank so that the next 2 pages of the criterion can be side by side. And we go on through the 8 teaching standards, and we aren't going to spend time on those. As Meredith had said earlier, those we will address on a separate webinar. In the back of the document on page 22, you'll see Appendix A, which is the site visit checklist for school improvement visits. So if your school is up for a DE site visit, this is the document at this current time that's used. I want to point out that this black area is the area that's used. The red area has been added by us of some possible suggested artifacts that you might use to show how you are providing a school counseling program. And then if you look to the very last page,
then you'll go ahead and see all of the committee members, school counselors across the state that we need to thank and recognize for their work contributing to this document, and also many of their administrators and other administrators that took the time to review multiple drafts and provide feedback, as this has been a continual process of refinement and collaboration across the state.
So thank you for watching this, and be sure to watch the next webinars where we break down each of the teaching standards and the aligned competencies for all 8 standards. Again, if you have any questions, any feedback, or any suggestions, please contact Sue Shermer at Heartland Area Education Agency or Meredith Doman at Des Moines Schools.